In the heart of London, amidst the bustling sounds of the city, Gilderoy meticulously pieced together the world through sound. A sound engineer by trade, his life was a symphony of orderly audio tracks and precisely calibrated equipment. However, his latest assignment was about to shatter this compassed existence. It was a chilly morning when the letter arrived, bearing an offer that piqued his curiosity and apprehension alike. An Italian film company sought his expertise for the post-production of their latest horror film. The opportunity was both prestigious and daunting. This would be his first international project, and his first foray into the macabre genre of Italian cinema, renowned for its intensity and emotional depth. As Gilderoy packed his belongings, his mind teetered between excitement for the professional challenge and unease about the unknown. His familiarity with the nuances of sound was his anchor, but the content of this particular film, steeped in horror and mystery, was alien territory. With his equipment secured and his resolve steadied, he boarded the flight to Italy. Upon his arrival, the stark contrast between the vibrant, chaotic life in Italy and his reserved, orderly London existence struck him immediately. The language barrier loomed large, and the sprawling, somewhat dilapidated film studio in the outskirts of Rome didn't help to ease his nerves. This was the 1970s, a time when Italy buzzed with artistic experimentation, yet for Gilderoy, it felt like stepping into a different realm, a place where the lines between reality and filmic horror could all too easily blur. Gilderoy, clutching his briefcase filled with meticulously organized sound equipment, stepped timidly into the cavernous, shadow-filled studio where his new assignment awaited. The Italian crew, a lively group draped in an array of faded jeans and vibrant scarves, buzzed around the set with an energy that was both infectious and slightly overwhelming. The director, a charismatic man with an intense gaze and a thick Italian accent, extended a hand that was as firm as his reputation. "Benvenuto, Gilderoy," he boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. The rest of the crew, though friendly, communicated in rapid Italian, punctuated by expressive gestures that seemed to dance through the air. As introductions continued, Gilderoy felt an undercurrent of intimidation beneath the warmth. Their passion for the film was palpable, almost a living entity in the room, and their discussions about scenes and shots were peppered with fervent debates that he could barely follow. Each member of the crew exuded a confidence in their craft that made Gilderoy acutely aware of his outsider status, heightening his sense of isolation in this foreign environment. This mix of admiration and alienation swirled within him as he was led to his workspace, a corner of the studio, surrounded by aging film reels and antiquated sound equipment, far removed from the modernity of his London studio. Here, amidst the passionate yet daunting presence of his new colleagues, Gilderoy realized that the challenge he faced was not just professional, but deeply personal. The director led Gilderoy through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, their walls lined with faded movie posters, until they reached a secluded room at the back of the studio. This was to be Gilderoy's domain for the duration of his stay. The space was a stark departure from the modern, well-equipped studios he was accustomed to in London. Here, the air was thick with the musty scent of old wood and metal, and the room was cluttered with relics of a bygone era in film production. The equipment that surrounded him seemed to have a life of its own. Ancient tape recorders, their reels larger than dinner plates, sat alongside bulky sound mixers with knobs and levers worn smooth by decades of use. The microphones, though vintage, had a certain gravitas, as if they had captured countless screams and whispers throughout the years. Despite the initial shock of the antiquated setup, a closer look revealed a method to the madness. Each piece of equipment, though old, was meticulously maintained. The wires were neatly organized and free of dust, and each machine was positioned so that it could be accessed quickly, a testament to the crew's professionalism. As Gilderoy absorbed his surroundings, the initial trepidation gave way to a creeping realization. The eerie, almost gothic quality of the equipment, combined with the flickering lights and the shadows dancing across the walls, lent an unsettling atmosphere to the room. It was as if the very space was designed to evoke the haunting sounds he was here to create, blurring the lines between his tools and the terror they were meant to produce. This environment, while intimidating, was perfectly suited for the task at hand, challenging him to harness its ancient power to breathe life into the horror of the film. Once Gilderoy had somewhat settled into his eerie workspace, the director called him into a smaller, dimly lit room where storyboards and film reels cluttered every surface. Here, he was given a detailed briefing on the film's grim narrative. The film, titled Voci dal Buio, Voices from the Dark, was set in a remote Italian village during the late 1960s. The plot centered around a series of brutal and inexplicable murders that had shattered the once peaceful community. Each murder was more gruesome than the last, with victims found in their homes, their lives extinguished in manners that defied logical explanation. The villagers, gripped by fear and superstition, turned on one another, their accusations and paranoia creating a psychological maze. Gilderoy listened intently as the director described how the film would explore the darkest corners of human nature when faced with unexplainable horror. It was crucial that the sound design not only reflect the brutality of the murders, but also the growing tension and hysteria among the villagers. The director emphasized that the auditory experience should make the audience feel as if they were part of the village, enveloped in the mounting dread and suspicion. As the director spoke, Gilderoy's mind raced, imagining the sounds of hushed whispers, the panic-stricken cries of the villagers, and the ominous silence that falls after a storm of violence. This briefing made it clear that his role was not merely to support the film's narrative, but to enhance its terror, to make the fear palpable. He was to be a key architect of the film's chilling atmosphere, tasked with crafting a soundscape that could evoke the visceral emotions needed to bring the horrific tale to life. After the detailed briefing on the film's chilling plot, Gilderoy was ushered back to his assigned work area to begin the actual sound editing. His first task was to view the raw footage that he would be working with. As the projector whirred to life, casting flickering images on the wall of his dimly lit room, a sense of unease settled over him. The footage was grainy, each scene bathed in the natural light of dusk, or the harsh artificial lights used during the film's night scenes. It depicted the eerily quiet village streets, the rustic homes of the villagers, and the dense, surrounding woods that seemed to watch over the village like ancient guardians. Each frame was infused with an aura of impending doom. As the scenes unfolded, Gilderoy watched with growing apprehension. The camera work was shaky, intentionally so, mimicking the perspective of an unseen observer, which added a voyeuristic quality to the film. This technique made the gruesome scenes even more invasive and disturbing. He witnessed the horrifying discovery of a villager, lifeless, with inexplicable wounds that no ordinary weapon could inflict. The panic and terror of the villagers were palpable, their faces contorted in fear and suspicion as they gathered around the grisly scene. The raw emotion and brutal imagery of the footage required Gilderoy to compose himself before he could think about the technical aspects of his job. The visual horror was not just a backdrop for the story, it was a visceral element that he needed to match and amplify with his sound design. The screams, the sobbing, and the ominous silence that punctuated the scenes needed to be crafted with precision to mirror the intensity of the visuals. This initial viewing was crucial, imprinting the raw essence of the film upon him, which he would carry forward into his auditory creations. As the days morphed into weeks, Gilderoy struggled to adapt to his new surroundings intensified. Situated far from the familiar comforts of London, he found himself ensnared in a cultural tapestry vastly different from his own. The vivaciousness of Italian culture, with its passionate conversations and lively gestures, was a stark contrast to the reserved and orderly manner he was accustomed to. Every day, the language barrier seemed to grow taller and more impenetrable. Conversations around him flowed in rapid Italian, peppered with colloquialisms and idiomatic expressions that flew over his head. Despite the crew's attempts to include him, their words often felt like an alien code he couldn't crack, leaving him smiling politely on the outside, while feeling utterly lost on the inside. This linguistic isolation seeped into every aspect of his daily interactions, from misunderstanding directions in the studio to grappling with ordering food at local eateries. The simplest tasks became Herculean efforts, fostering a sense of loneliness that gnawed him even in a room full of people. The disconnect not only made his professional duties more daunting, but also enveloped him in a pervasive solitude, amplifying the eerie undertones of his work and deepening his psychological disquiet. Gilderoy, engulfed by his sense of alienation, found solace in the one aspect of his life in Italy where he felt in control: his work. The studio became his refuge, a place where he could drown out his solitude with the sounds he crafted. As the night stretched, he spent hours experimenting with different materials and techniques to capture the perfect echo of a scream, the unsettling whisper of fear, or the howl of the wind that seemed almost supernatural. Using an array of props from rustling chains to wind machines, he created soundscapes that were so lifelike and terrifying, they made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up during playback. The studio, with its old creaking floors and the constant flicker of the projector light, seemed to come alive as he worked through the night. The line between the eerie sounds he was creating and the noises the old building made as it settled became blurred. This deep immersion in his work not only allowed him to escape his feelings of isolation, but also pushed his creative abilities to their limits, leading him to produce some of the most disturbing and effective sound effects of his career. As Gilderoy delved deeper into the haunting realm of sound design, the eerie echoes of his creations began to permeate his perception beyond the confines of the studio. Late at night, long after the reels had stopped spinning and the lights were dimmed, whispers seemed to linger in the air. These sounds, soft and indistinct, appeared to follow him as he left the studio's shadowy embrace. Initially dismissing them as the aftereffects of his intensive work, Gilderoy soon found these auditory hallucinations impossible to ignore. The whispers grew more frequent and invasive, seeping into the quiet moments of his solitude. Sometimes they seemed to call his name, other times they murmured unintelligible secrets. Each time he ventured into the darkened corridors to trace their source, he found only the silent, empty halls of the studio staring back at him. This unsettling experience began to fray his nerves. The empty studio, once a sanctuary of creativity, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, where every creak and sigh of the old building amplified his growing unease. Despite his rational mind telling him it was just his imagination, fueled by the intense focus on his work, the whispers remained a disturbing enigma, blurring the lines between the chilling effects he crafted and the reality he lived. As the whispers and noises continued to haunt Gilderoy, a seed of suspicion began to take root in his mind. The unsettling sounds that disrupted his peace seemed too coincidental, too perfectly timed to his moments of solitude. He couldn't shake off the creeping suspicion that perhaps his colleagues were orchestrating these eerie disturbances. This notion was fueled by the occasional smirk he caught on the faces of some crew members when he appeared visibly shaken. Their hushed conversations would abruptly stop as he approached, their eyes darting away too quickly, leaving him to wonder if he was the subject of their whispers. Each secretive glance and suppressed giggle began to feel like subtle jabs, intensifying his feelings of isolation and unwelcome. Gilderoy's days became a psychological tug-of-war. On one hand, he tried to dismiss his suspicions as irrational, attributing them to the stress and fatigue of his relentless work schedule. On the other, he couldn't help but scrutinize every interaction, interpreting innocuous comments and casual laughs as veiled mockery or signs of a deeper conspiracy against him. This growing paranoia started to erode the professional relationships he had, making each day more taxing than the last, as he battled the demons of his mind alongside the tangible terrors of the film. As Gilderoy immersed himself further into the gruesome and chilling content of the horror film, he found himself increasingly detached from the world around him, including the vibrant and bustling crew. The harrowing scenes he was tasked to bring to life through sound began to consume his thoughts, leaving little room for casual conversation or camaraderie. Each scream and whisper he engineered seemed to echo longer in his ears, pulling him deeper into a solitary world where the horror on screen bled into his reality. The lunch breaks he once spent trying to engage with his colleagues became rare moments of isolation as he opted to eat alone, consumed by the continuation of his work or lost in thought over the latest scene. His interactions became succinct, limited to necessary communication about the film's progress. The crew's lively discussions about weekend plans or local events seemed alien to him, a reminder of a normalcy he no longer felt a part of. This withdrawal was not unnoticed. The crew, initially perplexed by his increasing silence, gradually began to mirror it in their interactions with him, respecting the invisible barrier he had erected around himself. Gilderoy's world narrowed to the haunting confines of his studio, where he continued to create a soundscape of terror, isolated from the world by the very nature of the work he was so deeply engrossed in. Night after night, as Gilderoy lay in his bed, the boundary between his waking life and sleep began to blur distressingly. The intense scenes he worked on during the day infiltrated his dreams, transforming his rest into a series of haunting nightmares that mirrored the film's horrifying events. In these dreams, he wandered through the cobblestone streets of the film's village, hearing the distant screams and ominous whispers he had so carefully crafted for the soundtrack. The villagers' faces, twisted in terror or suspicion, haunted him, their eyes following him with accusations he could not understand. Each nightmare seemed to replay the film's most gruesome scenes, with Gilderoy helplessly observing or, worse, finding himself within the scenes as both spectator and participant. These nightmares were so vivid that upon waking, Gilderoy would often find himself drenched in sweat, heart racing, as if he had actually been running through those darkened alleys. The line between the celluloid horrors and his own subconscious fears became increasingly indistinct, leaving him to wonder if he was simply processing the day's work, or if the film was exerting a deeper, more sinister influence on his psyche. Each morning, he awoke more exhausted than the last, the weight of his nocturnal visions bearing down on him as he returned to the studio to face the source of his unrest. The production of the horror film was approaching its zenith, and Gilderoy was tasked with creating the sound effects for a pivotal scene that was crucial to the film's climax. This scene, the most intense and terrifying of all, was to be the culmination of all the horrors depicted throughout the movie. It involved the tragic protagonist of the film confronting the malevolent force that had plagued the village, resulting in a confrontation both violent and psychologically profound. As he prepared for this task, Gilderoy was acutely aware of the importance of his contribution. The studio was tense with anticipation, the air thick with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The room was set up with an array of equipment, from synthesizers to modified traditional instruments, each selected for its ability to produce the most unsettling sounds imaginable. Gilderoy worked with a feverish intensity, manipulating knobs and sliders to layer sounds into a symphony of terror. He blended the cries of the villagers with unsettling orchestral tones that seemed to seep into one's very soul, creating a soundscape that was more than just auditory. It was an immersive experience designed to evoke a primal fear in the audience. As the scene played out on the screen in front of him, Gilderoy timed each shriek, each disturbing thud, to the visuals with meticulous precision. His hands moved almost of their own accord, guided by a mix of technical skill and the emotional resonance of the film. The climax scene was not just a test of his professional abilities, but a profound moment of synthesis between the visual horror and the oral embellishments he crafted, aiming to leave the audience breathless and haunted long after the credits rolled. In the solitude of the dimly lit studio, as Gilderoy prepared the audio for the film's climax, he found himself drawn to the eerie echoes that had been haunting his nightmares. These sounds, which had disturbed his sleep and shadowed his waking hours, now seemed inexplicably suited to the scene at hand. It was as if the fears that gripped him at night were directly feeding into his creative process, providing him with the exact elements needed to amplify the film's terror. With a deep sense of both dread and artistic purpose, he began integrating these nightmarish sounds into the film's soundscape. The whispers that had seemed to follow him through the dark hallways of the studio were now woven into the background of the climactic scene, adding a layer of chilling realism. The distant screams that echoed in his dreams were synchronized with the film's visuals, where characters faced their darkest moments. This synthesis of nightmare and reality enhanced the horrifying atmosphere of the film. Each sound that Gilderoy selected and manipulated was charged with a dual significance, both a reflection of his own inner turmoil and a vital component of the film's unsettling effect. As he worked, the barrier between his fears and his craft continued to dissolve, blurring the lines between the horrors created for the screen and those that plagued his mind. As the project neared its completion, Gilderoy found himself increasingly ensnared in a web of auditory confusion that he could no longer untangle. The sounds he had meticulously crafted for the film began to meld indistinguishably with the whispers and screams that had originated in his nightmares. This convergence made it nearly impossible for him to discern where his professional creations ended and his personal hallucinations began. This blurring of lines caused his grip on reality to wane significantly. The studio, once a place of clear-cut boundaries between the real and real, now seemed to him a landscape where fictional horrors bled into everyday occurrences. The echoes of the sound effects lingered in his mind, even when the equipment was silent, resounding in his ears with a clarity that defied their origin. Each day, as he sat to work, Gilderoy felt an unsettling shift in his perceptions. The familiar controls and switches of his soundboard seemed to warp as Gilderoy's ability to distinguish between reality and the horrific scenes from the film deteriorated. He began to perceive unnerving parallels in his everyday life. The violence and fear that permeated the film seemed to follow him outside the confines of the studio, tainting his interactions and perceptions. Walking through the bustling streets, the casual brush of a stranger's shoulder felt to him like the sinister touch of one of the film's shadowy figures. The intense arguments he overheard in cafes, spoken in rapid Italian, echoed the film's climactic confrontations, filling him with a disproportionate sense of dread. Even the way the light cast long shadows through the narrow alleyways seemed to recreate the film's ominous visual style, making his heart race as if he were living in the very thriller he was helping to produce. This invasion of his psyche by the film's imagery was not just disturbing, it altered his reactions and responses. Simple conversations with colleagues or local shopkeepers took on an ominous tone, with their ordinary words seeming to hide layers of threat or malice. The boundaries between the scripted terror he crafted and the real world continued to blur, making every shadow suspect and every sound a potential signal of danger. Gilderoy found himself trapped in a waking nightmare, where the ordinary world was colored by the grotesque scenes of the film he was engrossed in creating. One late evening, as Gilderoy was laboring over the sound mixing desk, a particularly disturbing event unfolded in the studio that shattered the already fragile veneer of his composure. As he adjusted the levels on a particularly eerie track, the lights in the studio flickered erratically before plunging the room into darkness. In the shadows, Gilderoy thought he saw a figure moving silently across the room, an apparition so vivid it seemed to step right out of the film's footage. Shaken to his core, and with the echoes of his own created horrors ringing in his ears, Gilderoy hurriedly restored the lights, only to find the studio empty. The palpable absence of any logical explanation for what he had seen, combined with the mounting psychological strain, drove him to a breaking point. He stormed out of the studio and confronted the director, his voice strained with accusation. In a heated exchange, Gilderoy accused the director of deliberately manipulating the environment using tricks of light and sound to make him question his sanity. He argued that this was a cruel and unethical method of extracting a deeper emotional investment in the film's sound design. His accusations were laced with evidence of the eerie incidents he had endured, insisting that these were not merely coincidences, but part of a sinister strategy to blur the lines between film and reality for him. The confrontation reached a crescendo with Gilderoy's demand for transparency and respect for his mental well-being, challenging the director to defend the integrity of their artistic process. This intense moment not only revealed the depths of Gilderoy's unraveling, but also marked a pivotal turn in their professional relationship, as he sought to reclaim some semblance of control over his reality. During the intense confrontation with the director, the boundaries between reality and the cinematic world they were crafting began to dissolve for Gilderoy. The stress and the stark studio lighting cast long, dramatic shadows across the room, mimicking the horror film's aesthetic. The director's face, partially obscured by the dim lighting, appeared to Gilderoy as if it were a mask, reminiscent of the sinister characters from their film. The sounds from the adjacent editing room, screams and whispers meant for the film's soundtrack, bled through the walls, adding a surreal layer of audio that intertwined with their real-life argument. This dissonance caused Gilderoy's senses to reel, unable to differentiate the recorded screams from the escalating voices in the confrontation. As the director passionately defended his artistic choices, his words seemed to echo and distort, blending with the film's dialogue. This eerie merging of life and art reached a point where Gilderoy found himself questioning the authenticity of his own perceptions. Was the director truly in front of him, arguing about the film, or was this another scene playing out on the screen? The psychological and auditory overlap plunged Gilderoy deeper into confusion, blurring the lines between the film's crafted horror and the tangible tension of the moment. This ambiguity heightened the terror of the situation, leaving Gilderoy trapped in a liminal space where neither reality nor fiction held clear dominion. In the aftermath of the heated confrontation, the director, with a solemn demeanor, led Gilderoy into a quiet, isolated room within the studio. There, he revealed a truth that unraveled the fabric of Gilderoy's recent experiences. The entire film project, with its intense focus on horrifying soundscapes, was actually a carefully orchestrated psychological study. The director explained that the film's primary purpose was not commercial release, but an academic exploration into how sound influences psychological states and perceptions of reality. Gilderoy, with his expert sensitivity to sound and his isolated position as a foreigner, was chosen as the unwitting subject of this experiment. The crew had subtly manipulated his environment to intensify his experiences. Those whispers, shadows, and eerie occurrences were engineered to see how sound could alter one's mental and emotional state. This revelation struck Gilderoy with a mixture of betrayal and enlightenment. Every strange occurrence and unsettling feeling that he attributed to his own deteriorating psyche or supernatural influences were, in fact, deliberate manipulations. The film, the studio, and even his nightmares were part of a controlled environment designed to push the limits of his fear and anxiety through auditory stimuli. As the director presented data and observations, noting Gilderoy's reactions and the subsequent effects on his work, the sound engineer realized the depth of the deception. This twist not only shifted his understanding of his role in the project, but also left him questioning the ethics of such an experiment and its profound implications on his perception of reality. In the final, haunting scene of Reels of Madness, the camera slowly pans through the dimly lit corridors of the Italian studio, coming to rest on Gilderoy. He sits alone in the eerie glow of the sound mixing board, the flickering lights casting unsettling shadows across his face. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stare into the distance, reflecting a profound disconnection from the world around him. The meticulous sound engineer who once thrived on control and precision is now a shell of his former self, his psyche irreparably fractured by the relentless auditory manipulations he endured. The whispers and screams of the film, once external creations, now echo endlessly in his mind, blurring into a continuous, indiscernible cacophony. The boundaries between the film's horrific narrative and his reality have dissolved completely. As the screen slowly fades to black, the haunting sounds Gilderoy crafted merge with his soft, murmuring voice. He is heard reciting lines from the film, his speech interspersed with bouts of laughter and sobbing, a chilling testament to his complete immersion into the fictional world he helped create. The studio, once bustling with activity, is ominously silent, suggesting that for Gilderoy, the horror of the film has become his new inescapable reality. The scene closes on this somber note, leaving a lingering sense of unease and a poignant commentary on the dangers of blurring the line between art and life. Gilderoy's journey from a diligent and detail-oriented sound engineer to a victim ensnared by the very essence of his craft is a profound narrative of artistic passion, turning into a psychological abyss. Initially, his arrival in Italy was marked by a vibrant enthusiasm for his profession and a keen eagerness to apply his meticulous skills to the demanding realm of horror film production. His reputation for precision and his deep understanding of how sound affects the human psyche were the very reasons he was chosen for this project. However, as he delved deeper into the creation of the film's chilling soundscape, the line between his professional achievements and personal sanity began to blur. The project, which began as an exciting challenge, slowly morphed into a sinister trap. The sounds he so artfully created for the film designed to evoke fear and suspense began to haunt him, spilling over into his reality, distorting his perceptions and undermining his mental health. The revelation that his experiences were manipulated as part of a psychological experiment added a layer of betrayal to his suffering. Gilderoy was not just crafting sounds, he was unwittingly the subject of a study on those very effects, turning his professional capabilities against him. His journey reflects a tragic irony where his expertise, once a source of pride and identity, became the instrument of his undoing. Reflecting on Gilderoy's transformation, the story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing oneself in one's work and the ethical boundaries of artistic and scientific exploration. It underscores the delicate balance between professional enthusiasm and personal well-being, and the profound impact that our creations can have on us, especially when they leap off the canvas or, in Gilderoy's case, out of the speakers and into our lives. The film fades back in from black to a slow, deliberate pan across the now silent and shadowy sound studio that had once been Gilderoy's realm. Dust particles dance in the shafts of light piercing the gloom, suggesting a space suspended in time yet eerily alive with the echoes of past horrors. The camera stops on a young, eager sound engineer entering the studio for the first time. His eyes scan the room with a mix of reverence and curiosity, unaware of the studio's dark history. The director, the same man who had overseen Gilderoy's descent, greets the newcomer with a charismatic smile and an outstretched hand. "Welcome," he says warmly. "I believe you'll find this project quite enlightening." As the new engineer sets down his bag and takes in the array of vintage equipment, the director continues, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of something less benign. "You'll be working on something that challenges the very essence of fear," he explains, gesturing to the soundboard that Gilderoy had once operated. The camera zooms in on the new engineer's hands as they hover over the same controls Gilderoy had used, his fingertips brushing against the dials and switches with tentative respect. The shot widens to include a framed picture on the wall, slightly askew, showing Gilderoy with a faint, distant smile, a silent witness to the continuity of this sinister cycle. As the young engineer begins to settle in, faint whispers seem